Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about the new orchestration model for virtual machine scale sets, the flexible orchestration model or VMSS Flex. As always, this video is useful. Please go ahead and like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified of new content. Now if we take a step back, way back at the beginning of Azure, I could think about we had regions, and obviously we still have regions. And if I'm deploying services, I want a certain amount of resiliency to different types of failures. So if I think about a particular region, what we had exposed to us at the time was the idea of a fault domain, a rack. There could be a failure at the top of rack switch, at the power supply units. So we could think about very often we had this idea of 3 fault domains exposed to us. We'd see this kind of fault domain 0, fault domain 1, and fault domain 2. And the way we used these was an availability set. So I would go ahead and create an availability set, so availability set 1, for example. And what that would do is, as I added resources into that particular availability set, it would distribute them over the fault domains. So I could create, hey, VM1 goes there, VM2 there, 3 there, 4 there, etc. So it gave me resiliency from a node or rack level failure, but it was limited. All of the VMs were created in a single compute cluster, which meant there was only certain VM SKUs supported depending on which cluster I was in. There were limits on how many I could create. I think I could have 200 instances per availability set. And I was having to create the virtual machine. So I would create the VM, put it in the availability set, at which point it would distribute it over the fault domains. It didn't give us any automatic scale capabilities. If we think about the cloud NAT consumption basis, often what we really want is auto scale, change the number of instances we have based on the load, the work that it needs to do. I could write something, but it wasn't native to it. Well, things evolved. What then got added in Azure was the idea of availability zones. So now we had this concept of groups of data centers. And what those groups had, if I think about my AZs, they had that independent power, cooling, and networking. So now at a data center level, I could think about, hey, I can now be resilient from not only a node or a rack failure, but something big picture like a power, cooling failure at an entire data center level. And what we would see for each subscription is 3 AZs in a region. So I would see an AZ1, an AZ2, and an AZ3. And that mapping varies by subscription. There's no correlation between different subscriptions. Now, those availability sets have no concept of availability zones. I can't put an availability set in a certain zone, not without cheating. If I use a proximity placement group and do some strange things, I can force it. But naturally, availability sets have no concept of those availability zones, which is really what we want to move to as much as possible. Also, if we think about those availability sets, all those VMs we were creating are often identical. If I have some service offering, hey, a back-end web service, they were all identical. They were all chickens. They all had exactly the same configuration. But I was still having to go and create them all. So what we had introduced was this idea of a virtual machine scale set. And what this let us do, it was really nice, is I had the idea that I would specify a certain template for the operating system it was going to use, a certain configuration. Now that configuration would be the VM SKU, so they were all identical. If it was spot or non-spot, again, they would all be either all spot or all non-spot. I could have certain extensions, and then I could also configure scale, both manual and I could do auto. Hey, CPU is over 70%, add 2. CPU is lower than 30%, remove 2. Hey, a queue depth is over this amount, add some. So I had all those capabilities. And as part of the virtual machine scale set, I had a choice of, hey, do I want to just make it regional? Or I could say, hey, I want them distributed over AZ1 and AZ2, or AZ1, 2, and 3. And then what virtual machine scale set would do, it would go and create them. Based on this template configuration, it would go and stamp out these virtual machines to that configuration. They were all identical. And the regular virtual machine APIs did not work against these virtual machines. It was very limited in what I could actually use. I didn't have the regular VM access or disk access or NIC access. And so what we can really think of this now with this new type coming in is we think of this as uniform, i.e. everything in that virtual machine set is uniform. It's all based on the same thing. And if I was to quickly go and look at the portal, and we look at one of these, if I was going to create a virtual machine scale set, create, we can absolutely still do that. If that is my goal, we have the uniform orchestration model here. And I just go and select the details for what is that template that it's going to base all of these on, all the same SKU. Is it spot or non-spot? The disk configuration, they will all have the same networking, same management. Hey, I have the scaling options, initial count, custom auto scaling, capabilities of scale out and scale in. So I have all of those options there. But as times have changed, we maybe want to be able to do some different things. There are scenarios now where, hey, I like some of the benefits of virtual machine scale sets. It does things like, hey, I can do a rollout of new versions, for example. It can actually, these fault domains, there's something called an FD equals 1, fault domain equals 1, where it does a max spreading. So even within the AZ, it still will try and distribute over as many compute racks as possible. But now we have this new VMSS Flexible Orchestration Mode, or VMSS Flex. And I want you to kind of remember this idea of the uniform, that we had that template idea. Because I'm going to kind of redraw the same availability zones, just so I can have a clean canvas. The whole point of VMSS Flex, as the name suggests, is it's flexible. I have more choices in what I'm actually doing as part of this. So now we have VMSS Flex for that flexible orchestration. I can actually now create an empty VMSS flexible orchestration instance. I don't have to have a profile defined. So when I use this word, this template for the uniform, I can think of that now as a profile. I can still have it in Flex where I have some configuration and some scale characteristics of it, but I don't have to have it. I could actually create an empty VMSS Flex. It has no profile, so it's just some configuration. And as part of that VMSS Flex, once again, I can tell it, hey, I want it to use AZ1 or AZ1 and 2 or AZ1, 2, 3. So I have the same options of, hey, do I want to do that spreading over availability zones? Do I only want to use certain availability zones? I have all of that configuration. I can also have those fault domains again. That max spreading on the compute side is going to do that. But ideally, we want to think about the availability zone as the fault domain as much as possible. Now, if I look at the options again, so let's just jump over super quickly. Now, through the portal, and this is kind of an important thing, if I select flexible, you'll notice it's still asking me for instance details. So this is the profile. The portal is basically assuming, hey, if you're using the portal, most likely, I do want some configuration that it's going to create and delete with that basic auto scale for me, which is why it's asking me for those instance details. I do not have to do this. If I did this through PowerShell or CLI or REST and ARM template, I do not have to define that profile at time of creation, but I could add it later on. So that is what the portal is doing. It's saying, hey, I'm pretty sure you probably do want that profile of VMs that it will basically stamp out based on that configuration that are all the same. but you don't have to. PowerShell, CLI, whatever, don't have to specify that. I can specify this in the portal and do an instance count of 0, so it won't actually create any anyway. So the whole point now is with this VMS Flex, what am I doing with this thing then? So yes, I can have a profile. So if we jump over and look at our VMSS Flex, optionally, yes, I can configure a profile. And just like the uniform, that profile, hey, I'm using a certain template, I have a certain configuration, I have certain scale configurations for kind of scale out, for example, and it will go and create those for me based on my VMS Flex. So these profiles, sure, it will go and create those. Now, a big difference is the VMs it creates are now just regular ARM virtual machines. They're not limited. I now have full access to all of the different VM APIs, the disk APIs, the NIC APIs. I treat them like regular VMs. So yes, these are VMs that it creates, but I have all of the regular ARM capabilities for those virtual machines. So things like Azure Backup, I could now use with these. All the things that I couldn't do before, I can now do even when they're created via that profile. So that's really the big deal. Now, most standard SKUs are supported. If we jump over and look at the documentation, it tells us about the types of SKUs I can support. And it sort of talks about, hey, the regular VM SKU sizes. So here it's the SKUs supported, D, E, F, A, B. It's the speciality SKUs. The ones that like don't support live migrate, they're the ones that are typically not supported. But today, all of the general SKUs we typically use for our regular workloads, I can use as part of this. So now here's the interesting thing that I can do with VMS Flex. Yes, it can go and create VMs for me based on the profile that I either create when I create the Flex, or I can add it to the Flex afterwards. I can only have one profile per VMSS Flex instance. But I can also now just create a regular virtual machine. I can create, in a way, a pet. I can create, hey, I'm going to create VM1 and add it to that VMSS Flex. So now it's part of the VMSS Flex, but now I can mix. So if you think about the profile are all exactly the same, spot, non-spot, same operating system, same SKU, same everything about it. But now I can also add VMs. So now I could mix Windows, Linux. I could add spot, non-spot. I can have different SKUs. They just become now part of that VMS Flex. So I'll add a VM there, I'll add maybe a Linux VM to here. A common scenario might be I have pets, specific VMs I've created, and then maybe for the profile, I use Spot. For those bursts, I might use Spot virtual machines. But I can now completely mix all of these things together. If I go and actually create a virtual machine, we can see the experience. So if I jump over, now I've already created 2 virtual machine scale sets. I've created one VMSS Flex that's using AZ 1, 2, and 3. You can see my location, zones 1, 2, 3. And then I created one that's just regional. I didn't specify any AZs. So that just has fault domains exposed to me. If I go and create now a regular virtual machine, what I'll do is I'll pick my resource group. Same region. When it comes to availability, notice we have this option, virtual machine scale set. Now I'm creating a regular VM, but I can select virtual machine scale set. I can select that VMSS Flex instance I've created, and then I could pin it to a certain AZ that's supported by that VMSS Flex. Now, if I selected a VMSS that didn't support AZs, well, then I just get the fault domain option because I can pin them to specific fault domains. But at this point, I am just adding virtual machines to a scale set. And again, I can pick that particular AZ. So I have a huge amount of flexibility in using the contents in that scale set now. It's not just some, hey, copy of that very narrow defined duplicates. I can also add in any virtual machine I want. And you think about the goal is this VMSS Flex is trying to be this super thin orchestration layer. So I'm not now making a decision, hey, do I want a VM or do I want a virtual machine scale set? Because hey, with VM scale sets, remember in the past, I didn't have access to the regular VM APIs. So I had a very constrained, limited thing of what I could do. No, now, hey, I can use VMS Flex. If I want, it can go and create VMs for me based on this profile, but they're now regular VMs. I get all of the flexibility. Or, hey, I just want to go and add some VMs to a particular VMSS Flex instance. Now, you may ask yourself, well, the whole point of the VMSS is generally they're all identical because they're offering some service. Why would I add maybe irregular virtual machines into it? So there are benefits VMSS gives me. Think about patching. So one of the things VMSS supports is that in-guest OS patching. Windows or Linux, critical security updates, it will orchestrate that in-guest patching AZ by AZ and in batches. It will also orchestrate VM extension upgrades, again, AZ by AZ in batches. If I just had a regular VM, I would not get that capability. So this is the capability that it's now giving me. Now, let's think about something for a second though. Autoscale. It still has autoscale. Now obviously scale out, it can't create individual irregular virtual machines. If it's scaling out, it's using the profile. The profile is where it can create virtual machines based on that template. But what about scale in? Remember, the whole point of this is the VMs are essentially all equal. The VMs it creates, the VMs I create and add to it, there's no difference in how they're treated. They're just virtual machines. So in a scale in scenario, my VMs are just as likely to get deleted as the VMs it creates. Now, in terms of the delete behavior, when VMSS creates virtual machines, it sets the option on these VMs to also delete the disk and delete the NIC. For my VMs, I get to decide that. If you've ever looked at when you're doing a VM creation, you can now configure what should the behavior be when the VM gets deleted. If you look at disks, you have this option, delete with VM. You have the same option on the NIC. So those VMs that the VMSS Flex profile creates check both these options. So when it deletes the NIC, it deletes the disk. If you manually add virtual machines to it, well, you decide, do you want the disk and the NICs deleted? So that's completely up to you. But it does not treat them any differently. The VM you added is just as likely to get scaled in as a VM it creates. If you want to protect your pets, you might treat these as a little bit special. Well, if I want to protect them, then the mechanism is, let's say this one is special, I would put an ARM lock on it. Now, virtual machine scale sets uniform has scale in, scale operation protection. That does not work with VMSS Flex today. So if I want to protect a pet that I've added to VMSS from its scale in, I put an ARM lock on it. So then it can't delete it. It can't do any operation on that. And that's really the idea. The philosophy now is a VM is a VM. The VMSS Flex is this super thin orchestrator so that yes, it can add instances based on this profile for scale out purposes, but it can scale in equally for maybe pets I create if I want it to, or the ones it creates. But they are now full virtual machines. So again, why would I do this? Why would I put virtual machines in a VMSS Flex? I get that orchestrated patching and extension upgrade. I now get full availability zone, fault domain control. I get that scaling capability when I use a profile. I get up to 1,000 VMs I can put in a VMSS Flex instance. And I actually get a much better deployment reliability. I get a smaller latency. It's using a whole next-gen deployment technology within the data centers when it's using these profiles, for example. It can take advantage of the entire data center scale instead of a particular compute cluster like availability sets were limited to. And really just keep that in mind, that this whole decision of do I create a VM or a VM scale set as kind of trying to be shifted away for. Now I just have this grouping construct. And that grouping construct happens to have the ability to stamp out VMs if I want it to, but I don't have to use that. I can literally just have a virtual machine scale set flexible orchestration mode with no profile. And again, I could add it later if I change my mind, but I just put VMs in it to get advantage of those orchestrated capabilities that VMSS Flex offers. So that was it. I hope that makes sense. Again, super thin layer. I still get all of the capabilities of the virtual machines. I just get benefits added on top of that. Hope that was useful. Until the next video, take care.